Some wounds never heal, and some men never forgive themselves. Elias Cordwood spent 40 years alone in a mountain cabin, carrying a secret so heavy it kept his own family away. When he died, his son and granddaughter came to bury him and found his door locked from the inside. For decades, nobody had been allowed past that threshold. The family expected to find nothing but the belongings of a crazy old hermit. Instead, they discovered journals, photographs, and carefully kept items that told a different story. Elias wasn't crazy at all. He was protecting something. What could be so important that a man would choose complete isolation over human connection? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through the Wyoming mountains like a blade, carrying the promise of early snow across the Wind River Range. Thomas Cordwood pulled his coat tighter as he guided his truck up the winding dirt road, the engine straining against the steep grade. In the passenger seat, his 28-year-old daughter Sarah stared out at the towering pines, her breath fogging the window. Behind them, Reverend Benjamin Cordwood sat quietly, his weathered hands folded over his Bible. "How much further?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence that had settled over them since leaving Cheyenne 3 hours earlier. "Not far now," Thomas replied, though his voice carried no warmth. "Maybe another mile or two." Sarah had never been to her grandfather's cabin. In fact, she'd only seen Elias Cordwood twice in her entire life, brief, uncomfortable encounters when he'd appeared at her grandmother's funeral 8 years ago. Standing at the back of the church like a ghost, and once more when she was 16, glimpsing him from across the street in downtown Cheyenne. Both times he'd vanished before anyone could approach him. Benjamin cleared his throat from the back seat. "Your father wasn't always like this, Thomas. Before the war, Elias was different." Thomas's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "That's what everyone keeps telling me, Uncle Ben. But I lived with him for 18 years, and all I remember is silence. The man barely spoke to me, barely looked at me. When I left for college, he didn't even say goodbye." "People carry their burdens differently," Benjamin said gently. He was Thomas's cousin, actually, but had always been called Uncle Ben, Elias's younger brother's boy, who'd taken to preaching after his own father died young. "Sometimes the weight of what a man has seen, what he's done, it changes him in ways we can't understand." Sarah turned to study her father's profile. She'd inherited his stubborn jawline and dark hair, but where Thomas wore his emotions openly, Sarah had learned to keep hers carefully guarded. "Tell me about him," she said. "Before the war, what was he like?" Benjamin's eyes grew distant. Elias was the kind of man who carved toys for every child in town, who'd ride 20 miles in a blizzard to help a neighbor with their roof. He had this way of listening, really listening when you talked to him. And he could make your grandmother laugh like no one else could. "So what happened?" Sarah pressed. "The war happened," Thomas said bitterly. "And when he came back, he was broken. Mother spent 20 years trying to put him back together, and it killed her. The loneliness, the silence, the way he'd disappear for days at a time up in these mountains. The truck rounded a sharp bend, and suddenly the cabin came into view." Sarah's breath caught. It was smaller than she'd imagined. A weathered log structure with a crooked chimney and a sagging front porch. The door was painted green, or had been once, though the color had faded to the dull hue of old sage. What struck her most was how perfectly it seemed to belong among the trees, as if it had grown there rather than been built. Thomas parked beside a rusted Ford pickup that hadn't moved in what looked like years. The silence after he turned off the engine was profound. No traffic, no voices. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk. "Lord," Benjamin murmured, stepping out of the truck. "It's been 15 years since I was last up here. Feels like stepping back in time." They approached the cabin slowly, their boots crunching on fallen leaves. The windows were dark, curtained from within. Sarah noticed small details that spoke of a man living alone, a single chair on the porch, worn smooth by years of use. A water barrel positioned to catch rain from the eaves. A neat stack of firewood split with the precision of someone who understood the value of staying warm through mountain winters. Thomas tried the door handle, then knocked out of habit before remembering. "Locked," he said, not sounding surprised. "Window around back might be easier," Benjamin suggested, as they circled the cabin. Sarah found herself studying the place her grandfather had chosen to spend his final decades. It wasn't the dwelling of a madman, as she'd heard whispered in town. Everything was orderly, purposeful. The small garden plot was carefully tended, though nothing grew in it now, except the brown stalks of what might have been vegetables. A rain gauge hung from a post near the back door. "Here," Thomas called from a window on the north side. "This latch looks loose." With some effort, he managed to work the window open. The opening was small, but Sarah was the slightest of the three. She climbed through, dropping down into what appeared to be a kitchen. The first thing that struck her was the smell, not the mustiness she'd expected, but something warmer. Wood polish, old leather, and the faint scent of the pipe tobacco she remembered from her grandmother's stories. The kitchen was spotless. Dishes sat clean in a wooden drying rack. The wood-burning stove was cold, but carefully banked, as if Elias had known he wouldn't be lighting it again. Sarah walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt from the inside. When she opened it, her father and Benjamin stepped through, both men removing their hats instinctively. "Well, I'll be," Benjamin breathed. The main room was small, but meticulously organized. A leather armchair sat beside the fireplace, a quilt folded neatly over its arm. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that looked well read. A small writing desk occupied the space beneath the front window, and Sarah could see papers stacked in careful piles. Thomas stood in the center of the room, turning slowly. "This isn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. Mess. Empty bottles. Signs of a man who'd given up." He gestured at the tidy space. "This looks like someone who cared." Benjamin walked to the bookshelves, running his finger along the spines. Philosophy, theology, poetry. "Look at this. Whitman, Emerson, Marcus Aurelius. These aren't the books of a simple mountain hermit." Sarah approached the writing desk. The papers were covered in careful handwriting, the ink faded, but still legible. At the top of the first page, she read, "Journal entry, October 15th, 1903. The weight grows heavier with each passing year, but I cannot set it down. To forget would be to dishonor them all." "Father," she called softly. "Come look at this." Thomas joined her at the desk, reading over her shoulder. His face paled as he continued down the page. "He kept a journal." "Looks like several," Sarah observed, noticing similar leather-bound books stacked in a drawer. "Decades worth." Benjamin picked up a framed photograph from the mantelpiece. The glass was cracked, but the image was clear. A young man in a Union Army uniform, standing beside a woman in a wedding dress. The man's face was handsome, confident. Unmarked by whatever had carved the lines, Sarah remembered from her grandfather's weathered features. "Your parents' wedding day," Benjamin said, showing the photograph to Thomas. "Look at him." "That's the man I remember." Thomas took the frame with shaking hands. "I've never seen this picture." "Mother never showed me." His voice caught. "He looked so young. So happy. 22 when this was taken," Benjamin said. "About to leave for the war. He was planning to come back and build a house for your mother, start a family, maybe run for mayor like his father wanted." Sarah found herself drawn to a corner of the room where several items sat displayed on a small table like a shrine. A military medal lay beneath a glass dome. Its ribbon faded, but the metal still bright. Beside it sat a wooden toy soldier, carved with incredible detail. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but something about it made her feel inexplicably sad. "What's this?" she asked, lifting the toy. Thomas came to look, frowning. "I don't remember having anything like that as a child." Benjamin examined it closely. "Hand-carved. Look at the detail in the uniform. It's Confederate, not Union. Strange thing for Elias to keep." They spent the next hour exploring the cabin's 2 small bedrooms. Elias's room was Spartan but clean, with a narrow bed made with military precision. The second room appeared to be used for storage, filled with carefully labeled boxes and trunks. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they gathered back in the main room. The discovery of the journals had shifted something in the air between them. This wasn't the dwelling of a madman or a broken hermit. This was the home of a man who'd lived deliberately, thoughtfully, surrounded by books and memories and whatever secrets those journals contained. "We can't read his private thoughts," Thomas said, though his eyes kept drifting to the leather-bound books. "Why not?" Sarah challenged. "He's gone, Father, and we're his family. If there are answers here, answers about why he lived like this, why he kept us away, don't we have a right to know?" Benjamin sat heavily in the leather armchair, and Sarah noticed how it seemed to fit him perfectly, as if it had been broken in by someone of similar build. Sometimes a man's privacy should be respected, even in death. "And sometimes," Sarah replied, picking up the top journal, "understanding is more important than privacy, especially when that understanding might help heal wounds that have been festering for 40 years. Thomas looked at his daughter, then at the photograph he still held, then at the neat stacks of his father's carefully recorded thoughts. Outside, the wind was picking up, and the first fat snowflakes were beginning to fall. "We'll stay the night," he said finally. "The truck can handle the road down in the morning, but not in a snowstorm. We can read enough to understand who he was, what kept him up here." He paused, setting down the wedding photograph. "And then we'll bury him proper and be done with it." But as Sarah opened the first journal and began to read her grandfather's careful script by lamplight, she had the feeling that understanding Elias Cordwood was going to be anything but simple. The first entry, dated just after his return from the war, began, "I killed a boy today who looked just like my son will someday. God help me, I can still see his face." The fire crackled in the hearth. The snow continued to fall outside the windows, and 3 generations of the Cordwood family prepared to confront secrets that had been buried for 40 years in the silence of the mountains. Sarah read the journal entry aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "I killed a boy today who looked just like my son will someday. God help me, I can still see his face." The words hung in the cabin air like smoke. Thomas set down his coffee cup so hard it rattled against the saucer. "Sarah, maybe you shouldn't—" "No," she said firmly. "We need to hear this." She continued reading. "His name was Private William Morrison, 16 years old, from somewhere in Georgia. Found a letter from his mother in his pocket. She was proud of him for serving the Confederacy. Proud. And I put a bullet through his heart because that's what war asked of me." Benjamin bowed his head. "Dear Lord!" Thomas stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the falling snow. "I don't want to hear about his guilt. Everyone in that war killed someone's son. That's what soldiers do." "Listen," Sarah insisted, turning the page. "There's more. The boy, I can't stop thinking of him as a boy, though he carried a rifle like a man. He was guarding a bridge outside Richmond, just standing there, maybe thinking about home, maybe about his sweetheart. I came around the corner and there he was. We looked at each other for what felt like an hour, but was probably just a heartbeat. Then training took over and I fired." She paused, her throat tight. "Father, he was protecting a bridge. Just doing his duty, same as Grandpa." "War is war," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Men die. That's the nature of it." Benjamin rose from the armchair and walked to a trunk in the corner they hadn't yet opened. "Thomas, help me with this." The trunk was heavy, secured with a simple brass latch. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay military documents, medals, and what appeared to be official correspondence. Benjamin lifted out a worn leather folder and opened it carefully. "Congressional Medal of Honor," he read from the citation. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." He looked up at Thomas. "Your father was a war hero." Thomas turned from the window, his face pale. "That's impossible. He never said anything about medals. Never talked about the war at all." Benjamin continued reading. "During the Battle of Five Forks, Private First Class Elias Cordwood single-handedly held a strategic position against overwhelming Confederate forces, allowing his unit to retreat safely. Despite being wounded twice, he maintained his position for over 4 hours, ultimately capturing 12 enemy soldiers and preventing a Union rout." Sarah had stopped reading the journal, staring at her father. You never knew? He never told me anything. Thomas's voice was thick with confusion and something that might have been pain. Growing up, when other boys talked about their father's war stories, I told them mine didn't fight. I was embarrassed. I thought he'd been a coward, maybe deserted. According to this, Benjamin said, examining another document, he was recommended for promotion to sergeant 3 times. Turned it down each time. He pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay the medal itself, a bronze star hanging from a red, white, and blue ribbon. Sarah picked up the journal again. The entry continues, "They want to give me a medal for killing that boy. Colonel says I'm a hero for taking the bridge, but all I can see is his face when he realized he was going to die. He looked surprised, like he hadn't really believed death could find him. Young men never do." She flipped ahead several pages. "Here's another entry from after the war. Came home to Elizabeth today. She waited for me, bless her, but I'm not the man who left. How do I tell her about the boy? How do I explain that the medal they pinned on me feels like a stone around my neck? The whole town wants to celebrate, but all I want is to forget that boy's face." Thomas walked slowly to where Benjamin held the medal. He stared at it for a long moment, then gently took the box in his hands. Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he ever say he was a hero? Maybe because he didn't feel like one, Sarah suggested quietly. She'd found another passage. "Elizabeth says I should be proud of my service. The preacher called me a patriot in church today, but patriots don't wake up screaming from nightmares about boys they've killed. Heroes don't see dead faces every time they close their eyes." Benjamin sat back down heavily. "Battle fatigue, they called it then. Shell shock. We understand it better now, but back then they expected men to just carry on," Thomas finished. "To come home and be the same person who left." Sarah continued reading, her voice growing softer with each passage. "Thomas is walking now, 8 months old and already curious about everything. When he looks at me with those bright eyes, I see that boy from Georgia. They would have been about the same age if I hadn't—" "The entry stops there," she said, looking up. Like he couldn't finish the thought. Thomas's hands trembled as he held the medal. "He saw that Confederate boy every time he looked at me." "Not just him," Sarah said, turning more pages. "Listen to this one from 1873. Counted them again today. 17 men I killed for certain, maybe more I can't be sure about. 17 mothers who don't know their sons are never coming home. 17 fathers who will wait by gates that will never open. How do I live with being the reason for so much grief?" The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire and the wind outside. Snow was falling more heavily now, blanketing the world in white silence. Benjamin pulled out another item from the trunk, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are addressed to various families," he said, examining the envelopes. "All Confederate names, addresses in the South. What do they say?" Thomas asked. Benjamin opened one carefully. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," he read, "you don't know me, but I served in the Union Army during the recent conflict. I'm writing to tell you that your son William died bravely, defending a position near Richmond. He did not suffer. I wanted you to know that he spoke of you in his final moments and that he was a credit to your raising." Benjamin looked up. "It's signed a fellow soldier who knew your boy." "He wrote to the families?" Sarah whispered. "All of them, by the look of it." Benjamin sorted through the bundle. 17 letters. One for each man he was certain he'd killed. Thomas sank into a chair, the medal still in his hands. "He tracked down their families?" "More than that," Benjamin said, continuing to examine the trunk's contents. "Look at this." He held up a leather ledger filled with careful entries. Names, dates, amounts. He's been sending money. Anonymous donations to war widows, orphans' funds, Confederate veterans' hospitals. Sarah looked up from the journal. "How much money?" Benjamin calculated silently, turning pages. "Thomas, this is thousands of dollars over the years. Your father lived like a pauper up here, while sending his army pension and everything else to the families of men he killed in the war." The weight of revelation settled over the cabin like the snow settling on the roof. Everything they thought they knew about Elias Cordwood was crumbling, replaced by the image of a man tortured not by madness, but by an almost impossible burden of conscience. Read more, Thomas said quietly. I need to understand. Sarah turned to an entry dated 1875. Elizabeth is with child again. I should be joyful, but all I can think is, what if this war had been different? What if I had been the boy standing guard and William Morrison had come around that corner? My child might never know its father, just as his children will never know theirs. The randomness of it haunts me. The terrible luck that made me the one to survive. She looked up at her father. Grandpa didn't think he was a hero. He thought he was just lucky to be alive when other boys from good families, were dead. Thomas stood slowly, walked to the mantel, and placed the medal carefully beside the cracked wedding photograph. For the first time, Sarah saw her grandfather not as the distant, silent man of family stories, but as the young soldier in the photograph, full of hope and promise before the war, taught him what it meant to take a life. We stay until we understand, Thomas said finally. All of it. Why he lived like this. Why he kept us away. What he was trying to accomplish up here. He looked at the journals Sarah still held. And then maybe we can figure out how to forgive him, or how to help him forgive himself. Even if it's too late. Outside the storm was building, and the three of them settled in for a night of discovering truths that had been buried under 40 years of silence and snow. Sarah opened another journal. This one dated 1865-1870, its leather binding worn smooth by decades of handling. The first few pages chronicled Elias's journey home from the war, but as she read aloud, the entries grew darker, more introspective. June 12th, 1865, she began. Reached the outskirts of Cheyenne today. Should feel relief, but all I feel is dread. How do I face Elizabeth? How do I pretend to be the man who left 3 years ago when that man died somewhere between Gettysburg and Appomattox? Thomas had moved to sit beside the fire, the medal box still in his lap. Keep reading, he said quietly. June 20th, 1865. Married Elizabeth today. She looked beautiful, radiant even, but I felt like an imposter standing beside her at the altar. When Reverend McKenna spoke about new beginnings and God's blessing on our union, I wanted to tell him that some men don't deserve new beginnings, that some men carry their endings with them wherever they go. Sarah paused, looking at the wedding photograph on the mantel. The happiness in that young couple's faces seemed tragic now, knowing what was coming. Benjamin had been sorting through more correspondence from the trunk. Here's something interesting, he said, holding up a letter. This is from the War Department, dated 1866. They offered your father a position training new recruits at Fort Laramie. Good pay, officer's commission, a chance to build a military career. He looked at Thomas. He turned it down. Why? Thomas asked. Benjamin found Elias's response written in draft form on the back of the official letter. Respectfully decline. Cannot in good conscience teach other young men the skills I used to kill young men like them. The army made me efficient at ending lives. I will not pass that efficiency to another generation. Sarah turned several pages in the journal, scanning for entries about Thomas's birth. September 3rd, 1868, she read. Thomas arrived last night. 8 pounds, healthy lungs. Elizabeth says he has my chin. Held him for the first time this morning and wept. Not from joy, though there was that too, but from terror. This perfect, innocent child, how do I protect him from becoming what I became? How do I raise him to be a good man in a world that rewards killing? Thomas's voice was barely audible. He was afraid of me? Of what I might become? Not afraid of you, Sarah corrected gently. Afraid for you. Listen, when I look at Thomas, I see William Morrison at 16, eager and trusting and believing the world is a place where good men do good things. The war taught me different. It taught me that good men sometimes do terrible things, and that the terrible things follow you home like shadows. I want my son to live in the light. Benjamin pulled out another bundle of papers. These appear to be letters from other veterans, he said. Men from his unit mostly. What do they say? Thomas asked. Benjamin read from one. Elias, heard you turned down the Fort Laramie position. Can't say I understand it. The army needs good men like you. The war's over, but there's still fighting to be done out west. Indians causing trouble, settlers need protection. Your skills are needed. It's signed by someone named Captain Morrison. He paused. Morrison. Think that's a relative of the boy, Sarah finished, understanding immediately. William Morrison's father or brother, maybe. And he's asking Grandpa to keep fighting. She found Elias's response in the journal. Got a letter from Captain Morrison today. He wants me to reconsider the army position. Doesn't know I killed his boy, of course. Would he still call me a good man if he knew? Would he still want my help protecting settlers? I think of William Morrison every day. I see his face when I look at Thomas, when I hold my rifle to hunt deer, when Elizabeth talks about the future. The captain says my skills are needed, but what if my skills are precisely what the world needs less of? Thomas stood and walked to the window, watching the snow pile up against the glass. So he quit fighting. Quit everything. Not everything, Benjamin said, continuing to sort through papers. Look at this. He held up what appeared to be bank records. Your father started a fund, anonymous contributions to establish schools in Georgia, Virginia, Alabama, places where those Confederate boys would have lived if they'd come home. Sarah found the corresponding journal entries. December 1869 sent another $50 to the school fund in Morrison's hometown. Miss Rebecca Montgomery writes that they now have enough for proper books and a new roof. She doesn't know the money comes from the man who killed one of their own, but maybe that's fitting. Maybe the boy's death can still serve some purpose, still teach something worthwhile. He built schools. Thomas asked, turning from the window. Funded them anyway, Benjamin replied. And not just schools. Look, orphanages, churches, veteran hospitals on both sides of the conflict. The leather-bound journal in Sarah's hands revealed more. I understand now why I survived when so many better men died. It wasn't luck or skill or God's favor. It was responsibility. Every breath I take was bought with someone else's last breath. Every day I live is a day William Morrison and the others cannot. I must live enough for all of us. Thomas sat back down, his face pale in the firelight. He thought his whole life was borrowed time. More than that, Sarah said, turning the page. He thought it was owed time. Listen, Thomas is walking now, getting into everything. Elizabeth laughs when he pulls books off shelves, or climbs where he shouldn't, but I see something else. I see possibility. This child will never know the weight of taking a life. He'll never wake up screaming from dreams of boys who died too young. He'll be free of my shadows, and for that freedom I will pay any price. Benjamin had found more bank records. The payments didn't stop with schools and orphanages. Look at these, regular money sent to individual families. Confederate widows mostly, but some Union families too. How did he even find them all? Thomas wondered. Sarah found the answer in a journal entry from 1870. Hired a man in Richmond to help locate families. Costs me $20 each time, but worth every penny. Mrs. Sarah Davidson in Savannah lost her husband at Shiloh and her oldest boy at Fredericksburg. She's raising 3 children alone, taking in washing to make ends meet. My monthly contribution buys food and keeps them in their home. She thinks the money comes from a Confederate Veterans Aid Society. I let her think that. Some gifts are better given in darkness. The cabin had grown quiet, except for the crackling fire and the sound of wind in the eaves. Outside, the storm was settling in for the night. But inside, 3 generations of the Cordwood family were finally beginning to understand the true weight their patriarch had carried for 40 years. He wasn't hiding from us, Thomas said slowly. He was hiding us from this. From the guilt, the responsibility, the weight of all those deaths. Sarah closed the journal gently. He thought if he stayed away, if he carried this burden alone, we could live normal lives. Happy lives. Benjamin gathered the letters and documents back into neat piles. Your father convinced himself that distance was protection, that his love meant keeping his darkness away from the people he loved most. Thomas picked up the toy soldier from the mantel, turning it over in his hands. The detail was extraordinary. Every button on the uniform, every line in the young face, carved with precision and care. He made this, Thomas said suddenly, to remember the boy, to honor him. William Morrison, Sarah confirmed, checking the journal. He spent weeks carving it, trying to get the face right. Wanted to remember not just that he'd killed a Confederate soldier, but that he'd killed William, a boy with a name and a family and dreams that would never come true. As the night deepened around them, they began to understand that Elias Cordwood hadn't been the broken, selfish man they'd imagined. He'd been something much more complex, a good man destroyed by doing necessary evil, spending the rest of his life trying to balance scales that could never be balanced. Sarah discovered the wooden toy soldier had a hollow base. When she turned it upside down, a small piece of paper fell out, yellowed with age. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a child's drawing in faded pencil, a stick-figure soldier with a big smile, signed Billy in uncertain letters. "He kept this with the toy," she said, showing it to Thomas and Benjamin. A drawing from the boy he killed. Thomas took the paper with shaking hands. How did he get this? Sarah found the answer in another journal entry. Found this among William Morrison's belongings after the battle. The other soldiers were going through pockets for valuables, but all the boy had was this drawing and a letter from his mother. The drawing shows him in his uniform, proud and smiling. His little sister must have made it for him before he left home. I couldn't leave it there to be trampled in the mud. Benjamin had been examining more items from the shrine-like table in the corner. There are other things here, he said quietly. A brass button, a small Bible, what looks like a lock of hair tied with ribbon. Keepsakes, Sarah realized. From other soldiers he killed. The journal confirmed her suspicions. Each man carried something personal, a photograph, a letter, a small treasure from home. I took one item from each, something their families would have wanted to keep. Not as trophies, God knows, but as reminders, as promises that they would not be forgotten. Thomas walked to the window, staring out at the storm. He made himself the guardian of their memories. More than that, Sarah said, continuing to read. I've been corresponding with families when I can locate them. Mrs. Morrison writes beautiful letters about William's childhood, how he loved to whittle and dream of seeing the ocean someday. She doesn't know I have the drawing Billy made of him, but reading her words, I can see the boy he was before the war made him a soldier. Benjamin found a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, correspondence from grieving mothers and widows. Listen to this, he said, opening one carefully. Dear anonymous friend, your donations have been a blessing beyond measure. Thanks to your kindness, we were able to give my husband a proper burial and keep the farm. You ask about Robert's character. He was a good man who loved his children and never raised his voice in anger. He carved wooden animals for the church children every Christmas. Sarah found Elias's response draft in the journal. Received another letter from Mrs. Patterson about her husband Robert. She describes a man who sounds like he could have been my friend under different circumstances. Strange how war makes enemies of men who might have shared a drink and talked about their families in peacetime. I killed her husband at Cedar Creek, but she writes to thank me for helping her family. The irony cuts deep. The weight of these revelations was settling over them like the snow outside. Thomas returned to his chair, looking older than his 56 years. How many families? Benjamin had been counting the correspondence. At least 30, maybe more. From both sides of the conflict. Sarah turned several pages in the journal, finding entries from Thomas's childhood. Thomas asked me today why I don't have friends like other fathers do. How do I explain that friendship requires trust, and I don't trust myself not to hurt good people? Elizabeth says I'm being foolish, that the war is over and I need to move forward. But the war isn't over for me. It continues every day in the choices I make, the distance I keep, the silence I maintain to protect others from what I've become. He was protecting us from himself, Thomas said quietly. December 1872, Sarah continued. Thomas is 4 now, bright and curious about everything. He wants to sit on my lap while I read, but I'm afraid to let him too close. What if he sees the darkness in my eyes? What if he asks the questions I can't answer? Elizabeth doesn't understand why I won't hold him, why I leave the room when he reaches for me. She thinks I don't love him, but the opposite is true. I love him too much to let my shadows touch his light. Benjamin had found a different kind of correspondence, letters from doctors and ministers. Your father was seeking help, he said. Look at this letter to a doctor in Denver. I'm writing to inquire about treatments for what military physicians call soldier's heart. I experience nightmares, sudden frights, and a persistent melancholy that affects my ability to function as a husband and father. What did the doctor say? Thomas asked. That time would heal him, that he should pray more and work harder to forget the war. Benjamin's voice carried disgust. Essentially, to get over it. Sarah found Elias's journal response to the doctor's advice. Dr. Mitchell suggests I simply stop thinking about the war, as if memory were a faucet one could turn off at will. He doesn't understand that forgetting would be the greatest sin of all. Those boys died, and if I forget them, who will remember? Who will ensure their sacrifice meant something? Thomas picked up another keepsake from the table, a small wooden cross carved from what looked like a tree branch. This is different from the others, he observed. Less refined. Like someone carved it in a hurry. Sarah searched the journal for references to the cross. Found this among the belongings of a boy who couldn't have been more than 15. Too young to be wearing a uniform. Too young to die in a ditch outside Petersburg. He'd carved it himself from a piece of apple wood, probably whittled it during quiet moments in camp, while thinking of home and family and the girl he'd left behind. Now it sits on my mantle, a reminder that war consumes innocence as surely as it consumes lives. Benjamin was reading another family letter. This one's different, he said. It's addressed to the unknown benefactor of the Morrison family, and it's from someone named Captain David Morrison, the same Morrison who wrote about the army position. Thomas realized, listen, sir, my investigation has revealed that our family's anonymous benefactor has been contributing to Confederate families as well as Union families affected by the war. While I cannot understand your motivations, I want you to know that your generosity has not gone unnoticed. My nephew William died at Cold Harbor, and your contributions helped his mother maintain her dignity during her darkest hours. Sarah looked up from the journal, her face pale. Grandpa was helping the uncle of the boy he killed, and the uncle never knew. The same man who wanted him to keep fighting, Thomas added, who called him a good soldier and asked him to train more young men for war. The irony was almost unbearable. Elias had been secretly supporting the family of his victim while being recruited by that same family to continue his military service. No wonder he had chosen isolation over the complex web of relationships that might reveal such painful truths. Outside, the wind was howling now, and snow was piling against the windows. Inside the warm cabin, 3 generations of the Cordwood family were finally understanding why their patriarch had chosen 40 years of loneliness over the risk of anyone discovering the depth of his burden. Benjamin discovered the bundle of unsent letters in a leather portfolio tucked behind the books on theology. The portfolio was thick, bulging with what appeared to be decades of correspondence that had never seen the inside of an envelope. When he opened it, dozens of letters fell out, all addressed in Elias's careful handwriting to Thomas, or my dearest son, or my dear granddaughter Sarah. Look at this, Benjamin said, his voice filled with wonder and sadness. He picked up one of the letters at random. It's dated last Christmas. Thomas moved to look over his shoulder. Read it. My dear Thomas, Benjamin began. I saw you in town yesterday with Sarah. You didn't notice me, but I stood in Henderson's doorway and watched you help her choose fabric for what looked like a new dress. You were patient with her indecision, gentle when she changed her mind twice about the color. You have become the father I always hoped you would be, but never showed you how to be. Thomas's face crumpled. He was watching us? Sarah had set down the journal and was sorting through the scattered letters, organizing them by date. There are dozens of them, Father. Years and years of letters, Benjamin continued reading. I wanted to approach you both, to ask about Sarah's schooling and your work at the bank. But what right do I have to your time after 40 years of silence? What right does a ghost have to walk among the living? He calls himself a ghost, Thomas whispered. Sarah found an earlier letter, dated 10 years prior. To my son Thomas on his wedding day, she read aloud. I watched from the back of the church as you married Elizabeth. She is beautiful and kind, and I can see in her eyes that she loves you deeply. I should have been there to walk you down the aisle, to shake your hand and welcome your bride to our family. Instead, I hid like a coward while my only son became a man without his father's blessing. Benjamin was examining another letter. This one's about your mother's funeral, Thomas. He describes the service, mentions how many people came to pay their respects. He paused. He talks about wanting to comfort you, but being afraid his presence would make your grief worse. Thomas stood abruptly and walked to the fireplace. All those years I thought he didn't care. I thought we meant nothing to him. Sarah found a letter addressed to her from when she was 8 years old. My dearest granddaughter, she read softly. You lost your first tooth yesterday. I know this because I happened to be in town when you ran out of Morrison's store, grinning and holding up something tiny for your father to see. You were so proud, so excited. I wanted to tell you about the tooth fairy, wanted to share in your joy, but I remained hidden across the street like some shameful secret. He knew about my tooth. Sarah's voice was barely audible. Benjamin had found what appeared to be a more recent letter. Thomas, I know you struggle sometimes with being a father. I've seen the worry in your face when Sarah asks questions you don't know how to answer. You doubt yourself, as I always doubted myself, but you shouldn't. You stayed. You chose love over fear, connection over safety. You succeeded where I failed. Thomas turned back to them, his eyes bright with unshed tears. How did he know I struggled with fatherhood? How could he see that from a distance? Because he was a father too, Sarah said gently, and maybe because he recognized the same doubts in you that drove him away. Benjamin continued sorting through the letters. Look at this. He wrote to you every Christmas, every birthday, when you started school, when you graduated. He documented your entire life from the shadows. Sarah found a letter from 5 years ago. Sarah, you are 18 now, a woman grown. I watched you give the valedictory speech at graduation, and I was so proud I wept. You spoke about the importance of understanding history, about learning from the mistakes of previous generations. If only you knew that your own grandfather is history's greatest mistake, perhaps you would understand why I cannot be part of your future. He was at my graduation. Sarah looked stunned. According to this, he attended every major event in both your lives, Benjamin said. Always from a distance, always hidden, but always there. Thomas sat back down, overwhelmed. Why didn't he just talk to us? Why all this watching and hiding? Sarah found the answer in one of the earlier letters. Thomas, I have killed 17 men. I carry their faces, their names, their final moments. I wake each night to their voices, asking why they had to die while I lived. How do I bring such darkness into your bright world? How do I risk passing this burden to my son, my granddaughter? Better to love you from afar than to poison your lives with my guilt. Benjamin discovered letters that revealed the extent of Elias's knowledge about their lives. He knew about your promotion at the bank, Thomas. About Sarah's interest in teaching. He even knew when you had that bout with pneumonia 3 winters ago. How? Thomas asked. He had friends in town who kept him informed, Sarah realized, finding references in another letter. Doc Henderson mentioned that Sarah has been asking questions about her grandmother's family history. She wants to understand where she comes from. If only she knew that understanding her grandfather would bring more pain than comfort. Benjamin found a letter that made him pause. Thomas, listen to this one. It's from 2 years ago. I fear I may have been wrong to stay away all these years. Sarah is growing into a remarkable young woman, but she carries a sadness I recognize. She feels incomplete, unmoored from her family history. Perhaps my attempt to protect her from my darkness has instead denied her the light of knowing her roots. I begin to wonder if isolation is protection or just another form of selfishness. Sarah looked up from the letter she'd been reading. He was starting to doubt his choice. Near the end, yes, Benjamin confirmed. The most recent letters show him questioning whether he'd made the right decision. Whether staying away had protected you or just hurt you in a different way. Thomas picked up one of the unsent Christmas letters, scanning its contents. He writes about wanting to teach me to hunt, to fish, to pass down stories about our family. All the things fathers do with their sons. All the things he denied himself and you, Sarah added. Because he thought his love was toxic. The three of them sat surrounded by 40 years of unexpressed love, unspoken pride, and desperate longing. Every major moment of Thomas and Sarah's lives had been witnessed by a father and grandfather who loved them so much he convinced himself that staying away was the greatest gift he could give them. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the cabin, the warmth came not just from the fire, but from the belated understanding that Elias Cordwood had never stopped being a father. He had simply been a father from afar, loving his family with a fierce devotion that he believed could only be, safely expressed in letters that would never be. Sent and Sarah discovered the hand-drawn map, folded. Inside, the back cover of one of the theological journals. The paper was heavy parchment, drawn with the precision of someone who understood military cartography. Dotted across what appeared to be a detailed rendering of the Wind River Range were 17 small crosses, each marked with initials and dates. "What is this?" she asked, spreading the map on the writing desk. Benjamin and Thomas came to look over her shoulders. The map showed topographical features, elevation markers, and what appeared to be carefully plotted coordinates. Each cross was numbered and corresponded to a legend written in Elias's neat handwriting along the margin. "Memorial sites," Thomas said, understanding immediately. "He buried something for each man he killed." Benjamin traced a finger along one of the marked trails. "These are all within a day's hike of the cabin." He could visit them regularly. Sarah found the journal that corresponded to the map's creation. "May 1875, she read. "Began the work today that should have been done years ago. Each man deserves a proper resting place, a monument to his life, not just his death. I cannot bring them home to their families, but I can ensure they are not forgotten in these mountains." The map showed incredible detail. Elias had noted water sources, seasonal trail conditions, even the best times of year to reach each location. This wasn't the work of a day or week. It represented years of exploration and planning. "Look at this," Thomas said, pointing to one of the crosses marked with the initials WM and dated 1865. "William Morrison, the boy from the toy soldier." Sarah checked the coordinates against a description in the journal. "Found the perfect spot for William today, a meadow that overlooks a stream surrounded by aspen trees that will turn gold in autumn, like the Georgia countryside he described in his letter home. Buried his mother's photograph here, along with the carved soldier and a letter I wrote to him, explaining why he had to die and asking his forgiveness." Benjamin studied the map more carefully. "Sarah, some of these locations are quite remote. Dangerous terrain, especially in winter." "He went anyway," she said, finding more journal entries. "January 1876, hiked to Robert Patterson's site in a blizzard. Nearly lost the trail twice, but promised myself I would visit each grave at least twice a year. Found the marker stone had been buried under snow. Spent 3 hours digging it out and replacing the items that had been damaged by weather." Thomas was calculating distances. "Some of these are 15-20 miles from here. That's a hard day's hike, even in good weather." Sarah continued reading. "Each site contains something personal from the man's belongings, something I researched about his life, and a letter explaining my connection to his death. I've also left items that represent the life he might have lived. Carved toys for the young ones who never became fathers. Small Bibles for those who died far from their faith. Photographs of the families they were fighting to protect." Benjamin had found another journal with more details about the memorial sites. "Listen to this. Corporal James Fletcher's site includes the harmonica found in his pack and a small music box I purchased in Denver. His wife wrote that he loved to play music for their children. I thought music should play over his resting place in these mountains, even if his children cannot hear it." The scope of Elias's project was staggering. He hadn't simply marked the graves, he had created detailed shrines to lives cut short, complete with research about each man's family, interests, and dreams. "This one's different," Thomas noted, pointing to a cross marked EC, dated 1870. Those are his initials. Sarah found the reference. Today I prepared my own memorial site. When my time comes, I want to rest among the men whose deaths I carry. I've chosen a spot overlooking all the others, where I can continue watching over them in death as I've tried to do in life. Left instructions in this journal for anyone who finds it. I am to be buried without ceremony beside the marker I've prepared. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. He planned to be buried with the soldiers he killed, as penance, Sarah said. Eternal guard duty. Thomas studied the map again. We have to see these places. I need to understand what he built up there, in this weather. Benjamin asked, glancing toward the window where snow continued to fall. Tomorrow, if the storm clears. At least the closest one. Thomas's voice carried a determination Sarah hadn't heard before. I spent 40 years not understanding my father. I won't spend another day guessing at who he really was. Sarah found more details about the memorial construction. Each marker is built to last. Stone foundations, weatherproof containers for the personal items. I've used techniques learned from military engineering to ensure these sites will endure long after I'm gone. These men deserve permanence, not temporary remembrance. Benjamin discovered a supply list tucked into the map's folds. He kept detailed records of everything he placed at each site. Look, Site 7, Private Michael O'Brien, silver pocket watch. Letter from his sister in Boston, hand-carved Celtic cross. Small bottle of Irish whiskey purchased from traders. Prayer book in Gaelic. He researched their backgrounds, Sarah realized. Their heritage, their beliefs, their personal interests. These aren't just graves, they're biographical memorials. Thomas found another journal entry that made him pause. Thomas is learning to walk now. Each wobbly step he takes toward me feels like a miracle and a curse. How do I teach this perfect child to navigate a world where good men kill good men for causes they barely understand? How do I protect his innocence while preparing him for the hardness that life will surely bring? He was thinking about you, even while he built memorials to his war dead, Sarah observed. More than that, Thomas said, continuing to read. I want Thomas to be stronger than I am, braver than I've been. I want him to face his mistakes head-on, instead of hiding from them in the mountains. Perhaps that's the real reason for this work, to teach myself that running from guilt only makes it heavier. These men deserve to be remembered, but my family deserves to have a father who doesn't disappear into his shame. Benjamin was studying the theological notations on the map. He's marked each site with scriptural references. Psalms, mostly, but also passages about forgiveness and redemption. Sarah found the explanation in another journal. Left a passage from Ecclesiastes at William's site today. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to kill, and a time to heal. I killed him in his season of dying, but perhaps I can help heal his memory in the time that remains to me. The three of them sat in contemplative silence, surrounded by the evidence of Elias's extraordinary project. He had turned the entire mountain range into a cathedral of memory, a sacred space where the dead could be honored and the living could come to terms with the weight of war's aftermath. Tomorrow we climb, Thomas said finally. We see what he built, and we understand what kind of man our father really was. Benjamin was organizing the final papers from the trunk when he discovered a manila folder marked medical records. Private. Inside were documents that shouldn't have existed. Hospital records from Cheyenne General, dated 28 years ago, with Sarah's name on them. This doesn't make sense, he said, frowning at the papers. Why would your grandfather have Sarah's birth records? Sarah looked up from the journal she'd been reading. What birth records? Benjamin spread the papers on the desk. Hospital admission forms, medical charts, even a doctor's notes. But the timeline is wrong. According to this, you were born here, not in town. Thomas came to examine the documents, his face growing pale as he read. These are from when Elizabeth was having complications. The difficult birth. What complications? Sarah asked. Mother always said I was born at home with a midwife. Benjamin continued reading. According to Dr. Henderson's notes, your mother was in labor for 18 hours with severe bleeding. The midwife couldn't stop the hemorrhaging. He looked up. Thomas, it says here that you brought Elizabeth to this cabin for emergency treatment. Thomas sank into a chair, his hand pressed to his forehead. I remember now. God help me, I'd blocked it out. Blocked what out? Sarah demanded. You were dying, Thomas said quietly. Both of you. The birth had gone wrong, and Elizabeth was bleeding to death. Dr. Henderson was out of town, and the midwife said there was nothing more she could do. Benjamin found a detailed medical report in Elias's handwriting. Your grandfather documented everything. Thomas arrived at 2 a.m. with Elizabeth unconscious from blood loss. Baby Sarah blue from lack of oxygen. Elizabeth's pulse barely detectable. Applied battlefield medical techniques learned during the war. Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached for the papers. Grandpa saved our lives. Thomas nodded slowly, the memories returning. I was desperate. Elizabeth was dying in my arms. You weren't breathing. And I remembered my father talking about treating wounded soldiers. I drove up here in the middle of the night, praying he would help us. What did he do? Sarah asked, scanning the medical notes. Benjamin read from Elias's detailed account. Used pressure points to control bleeding, techniques learned from battlefield surgeons. Cleared baby's airway using methods I'd seen used on soldiers who'd nearly drowned. Elizabeth required transfusion. I donated blood directly, as I'd done for wounded comrades during the war. Thomas's voice was thick with emotion. He worked on you both for hours. His hands were so steady, so sure. I'd never seen him focus like that before. It was like watching the soldier he used to be. Sarah found more details in her grandfather's notes. Baby Sarah responded to resuscitation after 4 minutes. Elizabeth's bleeding controlled through combination of pressure and herbal remedies learned from Indian guides during wartime. Both stable by dawn. Thomas refused to leave for 3 days until certain they would survive. 3 days. Sarah looked at her father. We stayed here for 3 days. You were so small, so fragile, Thomas said. Elizabeth was weak from blood loss. Your grandfather insisted we stay until you were both strong enough for the journey back to town. Benjamin discovered another section of notes. Thomas sleeps beside Elizabeth's bed, holds baby Sarah whenever she cries. Haven't seen him this gentle since he was a child himself. Perhaps new life can heal old wounds. Perhaps saving lives can balance taking them. Sarah was reading her grandfather's personal reflections on the experience. For the first time since the war, my hands brought life instead of death. Baby Sarah's first breath was the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. When she opened her eyes and looked at me, I saw not accusation but trust. Perhaps redemption comes not through penance, but through service to the living. Thomas suddenly understood something that had puzzled him for years. That's why you always seem different from other babies, Sarah. More alert, more aware. Your grandfather said you were born twice, once from your mother and once from his efforts to save you. Benjamin found the most significant document, a letter addressed to Thomas, but never sent. My dear son, he read aloud, I know you will never speak of what happened in this cabin, just as you protected my secret about the Confederate gold we found. But I want you to know that these 3 days with you and your family were the happiest of my life since returning from the war. Holding my granddaughter, watching you become a father, seeing Elizabeth smile as she recovered, this was what I fought for. What all those boys died for moments like these when life triumphs over death, Confederate gold. Sarah asked, confused. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Something else I'd forgotten. During those 3 days, while you and your mother were recovering, I helped your grandfather with some work around the cabin. We found an old ammunition box buried behind the woodshed. Benjamin found references to this discovery in another journal. Thomas helped me excavate the Confederate supply cache I discovered years ago. Gold coins, jewelry, documents, probably buried by Confederate soldiers retreating through this area after a failed raid. Thomas suggested we turn it over to authorities, but I convinced him it should go toward our family's needs. Sarah was processing this revelation. The money he was sending to Confederate families, it came from Confederate gold. Some of it, Thomas confirmed. Your grandfather saw it as justice, Confederate treasure helping Confederate widows and orphans. But most of it went toward your education, Sarah. Your school fees, your books, your clothes, all paid for anonymously by your grandfather using that gold. Benjamin found the financial records. Look at this. Every major expense in Sarah's life, schooling, medical bills, even your wedding dress, covered by anonymous donations that Thomas thought came from a church fund. You knew? Sarah asked her father. I suspected, especially after those 3 days here. But your grandfather made me promise never to tell anyone about the emergency birth or the gold or anything else that happened in this cabin. He said some secrets were meant to protect people, not hurt them. Sarah found her grandfather's explanation in another letter. My rule about never allowing visitors was not about madness or shame. It was about protecting this secret. If anyone discovered that I had saved Thomas's family using Confederate gold and battlefield medicine, questions would arise that could hurt them all. Better to be thought a hermit than to risk exposing the truth. Benjamin was putting together the final pieces. So his isolation wasn't just about guilt over the war. It was about protecting a secret that connected to you. Sarah, he stayed away to keep anyone from discovering what happened here. Thomas stood and walked to the mantel, picking up the wedding photograph again. All these years, I thought he didn't care about us. But he was the reason Sarah lived. The reason Elizabeth survived. He broke his own rule of isolation because his family needed him. Sarah was reading the final entry about that night. Thomas thanked me as they prepared to leave. He said I had given him the greatest gift a father could give, his daughter's life. But he was wrong. Sarah and Elizabeth gave me the greatest gift, the chance to save instead of destroy, to bring life instead of death. That night I remembered what it felt like to be a healer instead of a killer. The cabin fell silent except for the dying fire and the wind outside. Everything they thought they knew about Elias's isolation had been reframed once again. He wasn't just hiding from his war guilt. He was protecting the secret of their salvation, maintaining his distance to ensure no one ever questioned how Sarah had survived or where the family's financial support really came from. He saved my life, Sarah whispered, and then spent 28 years making sure no one ever knew about it. Thomas placed the photograph back on the mantel beside the medal and the toy soldier. He was still protecting us even in his silence, especially in his silence. Benjamin gathered the medical records and financial documents. Your grandfather wasn't the broken man we thought he was. He was a guardian, a provider, a healer who convinced himself that love meant staying hidden so his protection could continue unseen. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, but inside the cabin, 3 generations of the Cordwood family finally understood the true nature of Elias's sacrifice. Not just distance and isolation, but the daily choice to remain unknown as their secret protector and unacknowledged savior. Sarah found the final letter tucked beneath the blotter on her grandfather's writing desk, sealed in an envelope marked, "To be read after my death, Thomas Cordwood." Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal. Knowing this represented Elias's deliberate final message to his family. "Father," she called softly, "there's one more letter. This one he meant for us to find." Thomas and Benjamin gathered around as Sarah unfolded the pages. The handwriting was shaker than in the journals, written by an aging hand that knew its time was ending. "My dear son Thomas," she began, reading aloud, "if you are reading this, I have finally laid down the burden I've carried for 47 years. You have discovered by now that your father was not the madman the townspeople believed, nor the coward you may have thought. I have been instead a man caught between love and guilt, trying to protect you from the darkness while ensuring you had the light you deserved." Thomas sank into his father's chair, overwhelmed by hearing Elias speak directly to him for the first time since childhood. "I know you have found the journals, the maps, the evidence of my secret life as your guardian and provider. What you may not understand is why I chose 40 years of silence over one day of honest conversation with my only child. Let me explain, as I should have done long ago." Sarah paused, noticing the next section was written in different ink, as if Elias had returned to the letter multiple times. "The night I saved Sarah and Elizabeth's lives, you thanked me with tears in your eyes. You said I had given you everything that mattered. But Thomas, you gave me something far greater. You showed me that my hands could still heal, that my knowledge could still serve life instead of death. For the first time since William Morrison fell at my feet, I felt like a man worth saving." Benjamin had found another journal on the desk, this one recent, filled with entries from the past few months. "He knew he was dying," Benjamin said, scanning the pages. "He'd been planning this discovery for weeks." Sarah continued with the letter. "I stayed away not because I didn't love you, but because I loved you too much to risk contaminating your life with my guilt. Every time I looked at you as a child, I saw William Morrison's face. Every time you smiled, I remembered that his smile had been silenced forever. I convinced myself that distance was protection, that my absence was my greatest gift to you." Thomas's voice cracked. He was wrong. His presence would have been the gift. The letter seemed to anticipate this response. "You may think I was wrong to choose isolation, and perhaps you are right. But understand, Thomas, that I was a broken man trying to protect an innocent child from inheriting his father's brokenness. I feared that if I stayed close, you would learn to carry guilt the way I carried it, like stones in your pockets that grow heavier each day." Benjamin was reading from the recent journal. "Listen to this entry from last month. Thomas has become a better father than I ever was, despite my absence. Perhaps because of it. Sarah is growing into a remarkable woman, with strength I recognize and grace I never possessed. My greatest fear was that my darkness would dim their light. Instead, they have become their own sources of illumination." Sarah found her voice again and continued the letter. "I watched you both from the shadows of your lives, attending every important moment while remaining invisible. Your graduation, Thomas. Your wedding. Sarah's first steps, her school performances, her graduation speech about learning from history's mistakes. I was there for all of it, a ghost at your celebrations, but present nonetheless. The weight of this revelation settled over them. Every milestone they thought he'd missed, every important moment they believed he'd ignored, he had been there, watching from a distance, sharing their joys while denying himself the right to participate. There were times I nearly approached you both," Sarah continued reading. "Christmas mornings, when I wanted to knock on your door with gifts. Evenings when I saw you struggling with some decision and longed to offer advice. Moments when Sarah fell and scraped her knee, and every instinct screamed at me to comfort her. But each time, I remembered the faces of 17 young men who would never comfort their own children. And I stayed hidden." Benjamin found a list in the recent journal titled "Things They Should Know." He made a checklist of everything he wanted you to understand. "Listen, Thomas inherits the cabin and all contents. Sarah inherits the memorial sites and the responsibility for maintaining them, if she chooses. The Confederate gold remaining in the bank account should fund Sarah's teaching career, or whatever path brings her joy." "Teaching career?" Sarah looked up. "How did he know I wanted to teach?" Benjamin smiled sadly. "He listened to every conversation you had in town, followed every interest, tracked every dream. Look at this note. Sarah has the gift of making complex ideas simple, just as her grandmother did. She will teach children to understand history, not as dates and battles, but as human stories of courage and failure and redemption." The letter continued with Elias's final instructions. "Thomas, I have left detailed maps and descriptions of my memorial sites. Each represents a life I took and a lesson I learned. I ask that you maintain them not out of obligation, but as a way of understanding that every action has consequences that ripple through generations. Sarah, if you choose to continue this work, you will find that honoring the dead teaches us how to cherish the living." Thomas had been silent, But now he spoke. All those times I resented him for not being there, he was there. He was always there. Sarah found the most personal section of the letter. My dear granddaughter Sarah, you have your grandmother's laugh and your father's stubbornness, but you also have something entirely your own, a capacity for forgiveness that I never possessed. I pray that you will use this gift to forgive an old man who loved you too much to burden you with his presence. Benjamin discovered a sealed envelope in the recent journal marked Final Instructions. Inside were burial details written in Elias's careful hand. He wants to be buried at his own memorial site, the one overlooking all the others. No ceremony, no preacher, just family if we choose to attend. When? Thomas asked. According to this, he prepared everything weeks ago. The grave is already dug, marked with a simple stone cross. Even wrote his own epitaph, Elias Cordwood, soldier, father, guardian. He tried to protect what he loved. Sarah was nearing the end of the letter. I know you will have questions I can no longer answer, regrets I cannot address, and anger that I cannot appease. But know this, every day of my exile was spent thinking of you both. Every night was filled with prayers for your happiness, and every choice I made was an attempt to give you lives unmarked by my shadows. The final paragraph brought tears to all their eyes. Thomas, you became the man I hoped you would be despite my absence, not because of it. You chose love over fear, presence over distance, connection over safety. Sarah, you represent everything good that survived the worst of times. In you, I see hope that future generations will be wiser than mine, kinder than mine, braver than mine. You are my redemption made flesh, my proof that life can triumph over death, that love can overcome even the deepest guilt. The letter was signed simply, Your Father and Grandfather. Elias, below his signature, he had added one final note. The war is finally over. I can rest now. The three of them sat in the profound silence that followed. Outside, the storm had cleared, and moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the cabin where 4 generations of Cordwood family history had been preserved in journals, letters, and carefully guarded secrets. We bury him tomorrow, Thomas said finally, at his memorial site as he requested. But first, we visit the other graves. We see what he built, and we understand what it meant. Sarah carefully folded the letter and placed it with the other family documents. And after that, Thomas looked around the cabin that had sheltered his father's secrets for 40 years. After that, we decide how to honor his memory while choosing a different path. We learn from his love while avoiding his mistakes. Benjamin closed the recent journal and set it with the others. He spent a lifetime trying to balance scales that couldn't be balanced. Maybe our job is to understand that some debts can't be paid, only forgiven. As they prepared for bed in the cabin where Sarah had once been saved and where Elias had spent decades wrestling with his conscience, they understood that tomorrow would bring not just a burial, but a reckoning with everything they had learned about love, sacrifice, and the long shadows cast by choices made in youth and carried into old age. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Wind River Range, the storm having passed in the night and left the world wrapped in pristine snow. Thomas stood on the cabin porch, breathing the thin mountain air and studying the map that would guide them to his father's final resting place. Sarah emerged from the cabin carrying the burial shroud they had discovered in Elias's bedroom, a remarkable piece of craftsmanship that told its own story. The fabric was a patchwork creation, sewn together from pieces of his old Union Army uniform and what appeared to be sections of a woman's dress in faded blue silk. He made this himself, Sarah said, running her fingers over the careful stitches. Look at the detail. Benjamin examined the shroud in the morning light. The blue silk, that's from your grandmother's wedding dress. See how he incorporated the lace from her sleeves into the border. Thomas recognized the military wool immediately. Those are the sleeve patches from his uniform jacket. He kept pieces of both his identities, soldier and husband, and wove them together. They had spent an hour that morning preparing for the journey to Elias's memorial site. According to his detailed instructions, It lay 3 miles up a steep trail that wound through pine forests and across exposed ridges. The site overlooked all 17 of the other memorial locations, positioned so that Elias could continue his eternal watch over the men whose deaths he carried. "Are we ready?" Thomas asked, shouldering the pack that contained his father's personal effects and the tools needed for the burial service. Sarah nodded, wrapping the shroud carefully in oilcloth to protect it during the climb. Benjamin carried his Bible and a small collection of items they had chosen to place with Elias, his Congressional Medal of Honor, one of the unsent letters to Thomas, and the carved toy soldier that had started their journey of understanding. The trail was steep and treacherous in the snow, but Elias had chosen his route well. Switchbacks eased the grade, and blazes marked on trees showed the way even when the path disappeared under drifts. They climbed in contemplative silence, each step bringing them closer to the final chapter of their father's and grandfather's story. After 2 hours, they reached a broad meadow that opened toward the south, offering a panoramic view of the valley below and the mountain peaks beyond. In the center of the clearing, a simple stone cross rose from the earth beside a carefully prepared gravesite. "Here," Thomas said, reading the coordinates on the map. "This is where he chose to rest." The grave had been dug with military precision, exact dimensions, straight edges, the excavated earth piled neatly to one side and covered with canvas to protect it from the weather. Beside the hole sat a wooden marker with Elias's chosen epitaph carved in simple letters. He tried to protect what he loved. Sarah spread the burial shroud on the snow, and they arranged Elias's body with gentle care. In the morning sunlight, his weathered face looked peaceful, finally free of the burden that had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Benjamin opened his Bible and began the service with words from Ecclesiastes. "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to kill and a time to heal." Thomas stepped forward to deliver the eulogy he had composed during the climb. Elias Cordwood was a man who carried the weight of war long after the battles ended. He was a father who loved his family so much he convinced himself that staying away was the greatest gift he could give them. He was wrong about the distance, but he was right about the love. Sarah placed the Medal of Honor on her grandfather's chest. "He saved my life before I even knew who he was. He watched over us from shadows and silence, protecting us in ways we never understood. He thought his darkness would dim our light, but instead, his sacrifice became the foundation for everything good in our lives." Benjamin read from the Psalms, his voice carrying across the meadow where wildflowers would bloom in spring. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." Thomas placed the unsent letter beside the medal, his voice thick with emotion. "These words were written to me but never sent. 40 years of love expressed only in silence. Today I finally hear you, Father. Today I finally understand," Sarah added the wooden toy soldier, the carved figure that had begun their journey into understanding. "For William Morrison and all the young men who died too far from home. Rest beside them now, Grandpa. Your watch is ended." They lowered Elias into the earth he had chosen, wrapped in the shroud that united his identities as soldier and family man. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the meadow, and beginning the slow work of melting the snow that would come spring, nourish the wildflowers that would grow over their grandfather's grave. After the earth had been returned to the grave and the simple cross secured at its head, Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew the cabin key, a heavy iron key worn smooth by decades of use. It had been around his father's neck when they found him, suspended on a simple leather cord that had darkened with age and wear. "Sarah," Thomas said, holding out the key, "according to his will, the cabin is yours now. But more than that, this represents something else." Sarah took the key, feeling its weight in her palm. It was larger than modern keys, forged by hand in an era when locks were built to last generations. The metal was warm from her father's pocket, and she could see where Elias's fingers had worn grooves in the shaft from years of handling. For 40 years, this key locked the door against visitors, Benjamin observed. It was the physical barrier that kept his secrets safe and his family at a distance. Thomas nodded. But today we're choosing differently. Sarah, if you accept this inheritance, you're also accepting the responsibility to keep those doors open, to break the cycle of isolation that defined your grandfather's life. Sarah looked out across the meadow toward the valley below, where she could see the distant roofs of Cheyenne. I accept, she said simply, but not to live in his isolation, to transform it into something better. Benjamin smiled. What do you have in mind? Summer retreats, Sarah said, the idea forming as she spoke. Bring families up here who need healing, who need to understand that forgiveness is possible. Turn Grandpa's sanctuary into a place where people can confront their own guilt and find peace. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. You'd maintain the memorial sites? All of them, Sarah confirmed, but not as shrines to guilt, as reminders that good men can do terrible things and still find redemption through service to others. Grandpa spent 40 years trying to balance scales that couldn't be balanced. Maybe I can teach people that some debts are meant to be forgiven, not paid. They gathered the bundle of unsent letters they had brought from the cabin, 40 years of unexpressed love and longing that had accumulated like snow in the silence between father and son. Thomas struck a match and held it to the corner of the first letter. These words were written but never sent, he said, as the paper began to burn. Today we release them, and we release the silence they represent. The letters burned quickly in the dry mountain air, their words finally reaching the sky as smoke and ash. Decades of Dear Thomas and My Beloved Granddaughter rose with the wind, carrying Elias's unexpressed love to whatever place spirits go when earthly burdens are finally laid down. Benjamin spoke a final prayer as the last of the letters crumbled to ash. Lord, grant peace to Elias Cordwood, who carried the weight of war longer than any man should. Grant wisdom to his family, who choose understanding over resentment, healing over perpetual grief. Sarah knelt and placed her hand on the fresh earth that covered her grandfather's grave. I forgive you for staying away, she said quietly. And I forgive you for loving us so much that you convinced yourself distance was protection. Thomas knelt beside her and placed his own hand on the grave. For the first time in 40 years, he spoke directly to his father. I forgive you for the silence. I forgive you for the absence. I even forgive you for being wrong about what we needed. But mostly, I forgive you for being human, for making the best choice you knew how to make with the pain you carried. Benjamin joined them in the circle around the grave. May this place become not a monument to guilt, but a testament to the possibility of grace. May those who come here learn what Elias learned too late, that love shared imperfectly is still better than love withheld perfectly. As they prepared to leave the meadow, Sarah looked back at the simple cross that marked her grandfather's resting place. Tomorrow, she would return to begin the work of transforming his burden into her gift, creating a place where others could find the peace that had eluded Elias Cordwood. For most of his life, the key felt different in her hand now, no longer a symbol of locked doors and hidden secrets, but a tool for opening new possibilities. As they began the descent toward the cabin, Sarah made a silent promise to her grandfather. She would use his sanctuary not to hide from the world, but to heal it. The morning sun climbed higher over the Wind River Range, melting the snow and beginning the long work of spring. In the meadow above, a simple grave held the remains of a complicated man who had finally found his peace. And below, 3 generations of his family carried forward not his burden, but his love, imperfect and long hidden, but real enough to build a better future upon. 6 months later, as summer painted the Wind River Range in wildflowers and green meadows, Sarah stood on the cabin porch, photographing a moment she wanted to preserve forever. Thomas sat in what had been Elias's chair, reading aloud to a young boy whose parents had come seeking healing from their own family wounds. Benjamin was tending a small garden where Sarah had planted herbs and vegetables, bringing life to the soil that had known only the solitary footsteps of a haunted man. The new family photograph would show something Elias had never allowed himself to imagine. His cabin filled with laughter, his sanctuary serving not as a hiding place, but as a beacon for those who needed to learn that redemption was possible. "Mr. Thomas," the boy asked, looking up from the book about mountain wildlife, "why did your daddy live up here all alone?" Thomas considered the question with the care it deserved. He thought that staying away would protect the people he loved. He was wrong about that, but he wasn't wrong about loving us. The boy's mother, sitting nearby with her own cup of coffee, nodded with understanding. She and her husband had driven up from Colorado after losing their teenage son in a car accident. They blamed themselves for allowing. Sarah's letters about the healing retreat had found them at exactly the right moment. "Sometimes," Thomas continued, "good people make choices that hurt even when they're trying to help. The important thing is learning from their mistakes." Sarah emerged from the cabin carrying a leather-bound journal, not one of Elias's, but her own, where she had begun documenting the stories of families who came to find peace in the mountains. Each entry was a testament to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of healing, even from the deepest wounds. "The Hendersons will be arriving this afternoon," she told her father. "Their daughter died in Afghanistan last year. They've been carrying the guilt of letting her enlist." Benjamin looked up from his gardening. "Military families? Her grandfather served in Korea. They're struggling with generational trauma, wondering if they're cursed to lose children to war." Sarah sat on the porch steps, adding notes to her journal. "Sound familiar?" Thomas smiled sadly. "Very familiar." The transformation of the cabin had been gradual but profound. Sarah had kept the memorial sites on the mountain, maintaining them as Elias had intended. But she had added something new, a visitor's book where people could write their own stories of guilt and forgiveness. The entries revealed how common Elias's burden really was. How many people carried weights they believed were theirs alone to bear. The cabin itself remained largely unchanged. The same furniture, the same books on theology and philosophy, the same simple beauty that had sustained Elias through his darkest years. But now it served multiple families instead of isolating one man. The silence had been replaced by conversation, the secrecy by shared stories of pain and healing. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Thomas said, setting down the book as the boy ran off to explore the wildflower meadow. "I think about that first night when we broke into this place, expecting to find the belongings of a crazy old hermit." Sarah laughed. "Instead, we found a library, a medical emergency room, a financial office, and a monument to 40 years of secret love." Benjamin wiped the soil from his hands and joined them on the porch. "Your grandfather would have been amazed by what you've created here." Sarah, all these families finding peace in the place where he could never find it for himself. "I think he would have been proud," Sarah said, "but also sad that he waited too long to learn what we've learned, that sharing pain makes it lighter, not heavier." Thomas had been carrying something in his pocket since the morning, waiting for the right moment to share it. He pulled out a letter addressed to the family of Elias Cordwood that had arrived at the bank where he worked. "This came yesterday," he said, handing it to Sarah, "from a woman in Georgia." Sarah opened the letter carefully. "Dear Cordwood family," she read aloud. "My name is Mary Morrison Williams. I believe your ancestor killed my great-great-uncle William Morrison during the Civil War. I've been researching family history and discovered anonymous donations that helped my family survive after the war. I recently learned these donations came from a Union veteran named Elias Cordwood." Benjamin leaned forward, intrigued. "She found him after all these years?" Sarah continued reading. "I want you to know that William Morrison was my family's favorite storyteller, a young man who dreamed of seeing the ocean and becoming a teacher. His death broke our family's heart, but your ancestors' donations kept us together during the hardest years. We hold no anger toward Elias Cordwood. War is a terrible thing that makes victims of us all. Thomas felt tears forming in his eyes. After all these years, absolution came from the family he feared most. The letter concluded with an invitation. If any of William Morrison's family would like to visit his grave in Georgia, we would welcome you. Perhaps it's time for healing on both sides. Sarah closed the journal and looked out across the meadow where the Memorial Healing Retreat, as it was now officially known, would continue its work of helping families find peace. The cabin door stood open, as it had every day since she'd inherited the key, welcoming anyone who needed to learn that guilt could be forgiven and love could triumph over fear. "I think," she said finally, "we should plan a trip to Georgia." As the afternoon sun painted the mountains in golden light, 3 generations of healing continued its work in the place where one man had once tried to carry the weight of war alone. The cycle of isolation was broken, replaced by the knowledge that some burdens were meant to be shared, and that love, however imperfectly expressed, was always stronger than the fear that sought to contain it. The cabin door remained open, and would remain so, a simple symbol of the truth Elias Cordwood had learned too late, that protection doesn't come from distance, but from connection, and that the greatest gift we can give those we love is not perfect safety, but honest presence in whatever healing may come.